Welcome back to Vol Studies. This is Chapter 5, Theoretical Pricing Models. We're going to talk a little bit about the importance of probability, look at some simple approaches to understanding the concept of expected value, and then of course graduate into an introduction to the Black-Scholes model. Now in Chapter 4 we looked at expiration P&L graphs. When you start at a market-making firm, you drill these profiles over and over so you can get a conceptual understanding of what it means to manage a hedged option position. Because it's not so intuitive if you're used to thinking of options as directional instruments. Once you hedge something, you change the payout profile such that now you're interested more in movement overall instead of conditional movement in the direction of the option. Now, when you do these payoff profiles, you realize counterintuitively that once you hedge options, you don't always want the market to go in the direction of those options. For example, if you own an upside call and hedge it, you make money more quickly to the downside than you do to the upside. This is generally true, such that when you are long options, you want to move away from them, and when you're short options, you want to land on them. Now, if you paid attention here, you realize that there's something missing from these profiles, and that's time. Natenberg calls this dimension here the speed of movement. He says that the fundamental problem for an options trader, you need to get two things. And that's not only direction, but it's time. No matter which angle you come at the subject from, when you talk about options, paths and probabilities are fundamentally at the heart of the subject. Natenberg talks about low probabilities as being cheaper bets. That's very basic. The lens with which you look at this is expected value. Now, this is a straightforward concept that he approaches first through the lens of the traditional six-sided die game. And you can see right here, the end result or the point of this is that the way you want to look at things is just assigning a probability to an outcome and then evaluating how much is that outcome worth, summing it all up, and that's your theo, or your theoretical value of the bet itself. And this is translatable to an options price. In market making, we're constantly talking about our theo. If you ever hear that term thrown around casually, the point of it is that's your theoretical value. That's your model's fair value at which, as a market maker, you have no implied edge to trade on either side of it. Natenberg goes back and forth often and reminds us how important it is to take into account interest and dividends. The only point I want to make here is that's entirely correct, but don't narrow your scope there. The point is a generalization. All cash flows either in or out should be accounted for and discounted by the appropriate rate. Moving beyond this, what's the goal of an options trader? And again, this is the lens of a market maker, right? So at a market making firm, you're trying to trade for positive EV or positive expected value. This is what we call edge. If we have a modeled value and we can buy something below it, that's edge. If we can sell something above it, that's edge. Now, as a first pass, you can liken this to the dice game and say, okay, that's like buying the bet for 3 or selling it at 4, and that's true. But in the real world as a market maker, it's like playing this game where the values associated with each outcome on the dice are constantly changing. That's just the nature of market making. It's dynamic all the time. To do this properly, we use models to describe all of the outcomes at any given state, and it's important for us more so to connect these together. It's more important to do that than it is to be correct about the terminal outcome. We don't care so much about what that future volatility turns out to be. We care more about, do we have everything priced correctly, together, and continuously now? In doing so, that allows us to trade one option versus another in a way that's continuous and free from arbitrage. Now, to do this as a market maker, you're required to shift your mindset away from prices and into levels, because the important thing is we're relating everything. Now, it goes without saying, but models are not perfect. Many blowups, in fact, arise out of a simple failure to grasp their very real limitations. And this is not typical on the market making side because market makers understand this and they're allergic to risk fundamentally. It's more common on lower frequency vol trading desks. For example, prop shops or bank desks. I can tell many stories where desks in excess of $50 or $100 million blew up because of this problem, where somebody was overconfident and literally just did not understand what they were dealing with. You'd be surprised. Now, in order to move from the six-sided die game to the real world, we need to translate our expected value framework into real assets. And so we do this in this next step before we get to the Black-Scholes model. We start with the understanding that the price you pay today for a simple linear asset like a stock or a future is a fair representation of all the possible future outcomes. There's no edge in just buying the stock. All those outcomes are implied in the current price. We don't actually see this distribution. It's not visible to us, but we take for granted that it's fair. Now, in moving beyond the simple underlying and into pricing of an option, what we need to remember is that an option gives you the right, but not the obligation, to buy or sell a certain asset at a certain time for a certain price. This means for us that we have to truncate or cut off an entire subset of this distribution and focus on only the part we care about, which is the part at which that option is in the money. So for example, this 100-strike call only has value when it is in the money. We're working here with the same distribution we had for the asset itself, but we're looking at the option's terminal price, not the asset's terminal price. The option's terminal price is dependent on the asset price, but it's the option's price that filters back into our EV calculation. So you can go through the math here. I won't do it for you, but it's fairly simple. Now, this example is basic and it's helpful to understand the lens of expected value. But as you go through this, it should strike you that something doesn't quite feel right about it. The equal distribution, or the equally probable outcomes across the board. Now, of course, that's not the case. In the real world, all outcomes are not equally likely, but that shouldn't be hard for us to correct for. And as you can see, it really isn't. In this case, this looks more like what we expect. Fundamentally, the base case is that we're not really moving much in either direction, and beyond that center of the distribution, it should become intuitive that the greater the move, the smaller the probability, and that's effectively what you see here, a simplification of that. This is more like a real distribution. Now, it gets a little more complex, because in the real world, probabilities are not going to necessarily be symmetrical around the price. But that's okay, as long as you assume that the price is the fair value. So you can wind up having distributions that are skewed or asymmetric, but you still have to operate around the principle that the price right now is a fair, weighted sum of all the possible prices in the end. And of course, beyond this, as Natenberg will often remind us through the text, you have to take into account the discounting of the cash flow you're receiving when the option expires. And in reality, you also have to discount the option itself according to whatever prevailing interest rate exists. This is fundamental, and it's nothing more than present value. And usually you simplify and assume that the interest rate is constant over the life of the contract. Now, in reality, it's a little bit more challenging because, of course, that interest rate is not constant throughout the life of the contract. It varies all the time. The best you can do is actually price an interest rate curve. And beyond that, you can't necessarily borrow or lend at the same interest rate. For the most part, this solves itself, especially in a liquid product like the SPX. But in more opaque products where clearing firms rely on assumptions, this becomes problematic for a market maker. Additionally, this last part should be obvious. We've looked so far at a series of outcomes that is very easy to wrap our head around. 5 terminal prices with different probabilities. But the reality is, in the real world, conceptually, the amount of outcomes are infinite. Price can go anywhere. And so it's no longer a simple case of mapping 5 probabilities to 5 outcomes. You have to move towards a continuous distribution. And this is where the Black-Scholes model comes in. The Black-Scholes model was developed around 1973, really at the forefront of options trading. Probably it's fair to say that options would not be here in the way they are now without this adjacent workaround modeling at the time. Now, I jokingly call it the BS model for a reason, and it's not because I'm trying to be dismissive about its quality. It's really just by the time you put the rubber to the road as a market-making firm, what you're using is, sure, it's a derivation of the Black-Scholes model, but your model bakes in a vol path or a price path or a skew path. You might have custom parameters that nobody's ever heard of, which makes for funny parties because when you meet up with people cross-firm, you can't even speak the same language because you don't call the same Greek the same thing. And it was actually funny for me, moving into the retail space, I never even used the word charm or Vanna. We had different terms for the combinations of things in order for us to more clearly understand our risk profile. The industry as a whole would not exist without this model, but it does have limitations. The limitations in the beginning were obvious. It only worked on European options. That means options that you can't exercise early. It also only covered non-dividend paying stocks, and of course, that is a problem. But these problems were addressed early on with modifications, and they were mostly easy to solve because they covered the underlying. They were not complications arising from vol paths or complexities in the space or idiosyncrasies. They were just simple underlying problems. That said, people still do rely on this model today. Fundamentally, the Black-Scholes model requires a couple of things. If you look at this list here, options exercise price, time till expiry, the underlying interest rate, etc. The only thing you can't really know here with any certainty up front is the volatility of the underlying contract, specifically because the calculation, if done correctly, requires you to input a volatility that is meant to be understood as constant over the life of the contract. Now, that alone is not true, and even if it were, whatever that future volatility is, of course, cannot be known either. And so in the real world, you start out by making markets around prices and then backing into the implied volatility. Now, once you have these in place, the model also gives you a delta. Now, this delta can be thought of as a couple of different things. When you're looking at the distribution, it's also the probability of that option settling in the money. For us as traders or market makers, it's really the hedge ratio. And so this all circles back to the concept of option replication. Now, this idea just maps back to that concept of EV, or expected value, where if you have a delta of 20, that's the same thing as saying that option has a 20% probability of expiring in the money, and the way you want to replicate that with the underlying is by owning 20% of the underlying. As the underlying moves, the delta will change, and you dynamically adjust that. And we know that as gamma. Fundamentally, this is how a market maker manages a book of options with delta exposure. This replication is the basis for what we talk about in our other courses at Vol Signals, because this does translate into real flows that move the market. The point being, of course, that any option that the market maker cannot cover or spread elsewhere, this net position, so to speak, the position that winds up requiring this dynamic option replication. And if you can understand that position, you might be able to understand something about the likely influence on the market that position has. And we'll, of course, talk more about that as we move through this curriculum. Now, for some of you, this concept might be unfamiliar. Delta hedging might be new to you. If that's the case, I suggest memorizing this table. It's fairly simple. You need to always be offsetting your options exposure. So if you're long a call, you need to be selling the underlying. If you're long a put, you need to be buying the underlying. For a market maker, you need to drill this over and over in the beginning so that it's instantaneous. There's no thinking about it. Now, as a market maker, the reason you drill this and things like this is because anything that's basic or fundamental or doesn't have a lot of complexity with it needs to be ingrained, because you're making so many decisions, multitasking at a fast pace. You just can't make mistakes because you have to think about things that could be automated in your mental process. Because if you don't, you tend to make mistakes, and mistakes can be very painful. This story here makes light of the origin of the term. We joke sometimes in the industry, but this term is used. If I were to buy a call and instead of selling futures, I bought them, first thing that goes through my head is, oh shoot, I Texased. Because apparently in Texas, you double your risk, not close it. Now, I don't know if this story is true, but it's funny nonetheless. But I will say from experience that the act of Texasing is very painful, very costly. When you're dealing with things that move tens of thousands of dollars per dollar, you do not want to make a mistake and double that risk and have it get away from you. So far, we've only scratched the surface, but in the next chapter, we'll dive deeper into the concepts underpinning volatility in order to get a better understanding of the models themselves. See you then.